The night she left, there was no argument, no slammed door, no tears tracked down the side of her jaw in the cold. Mara Voss simply stood at the edge of the pack's territorial line, the line of salt and pressed root markers that had stood since before her grandmother's time, and she stepped over it. One foot, then the other. She did not look back. She had learned early that looking back at things that had already let you go was the fastest way to become nothing. The pack leader, Cassius, noticed her absence at the morning muster. He stood in the assembly yard, counting heads the way he always did, moving his lips slightly as though the numbers might lie if he didn't recite them. 31. 31 instead of 32. He said her name once, very quietly. Then he folded it somewhere inside himself and moved on. Nobody spoke of her after that. It was their way. What they did not know, what no one in any of the 12 remaining packs scattered across what was left of the northern territories knew, was that she had not gone to die. She had not gone to fade, or to find some other community to absorb her. She had gone to the Ridge. The Ridge was a place the old ones called Veth Mura, the standing weight. The name was older than the pack's memory of why it had been given. It sat at the high edge of the conifer belt, where the trees thinned into something half forest and half sky, and the wind there had a particular sound, not howling, not whispering, but a low, persistent hum that you could mistake for silence if you weren't paying attention. Mara had been paying attention to that sound since she was 7 years old, the first time her mother had brought her up the trail to look at the view, and she had noticed that the hum did not change with the direction of the wind. She built the cottage herself. That part took the better portion of the first year. She was not a builder by training. Her hands learned as she went. The first walls were crooked. She packed them with clay and pine sap and the dried grass that grew in thick bunches along the northern face of the ridge. And when the first storm came through in late October, it pulled half the north wall out by the roots and deposited it 20 meters downslope. She stood in the ruin of it and did not cry. She noted what had failed, and she rebuilt it with more timber, deeper-set foundations, and a crossbeam arrangement she had worked out on the inside of a piece of birch bark with a charcoal stick during the previous week's insomnia. The second wall held. She planted in the spring of the second year. Root vegetables, because they were forgiving and did not require the coaxing that above-ground crops did. She dug the beds by hand, and amended the thin ridge soil with composted kitchen waste and the decomposed needles she raked from under the trees. The yield was small but real. She preserved what she could. She learned which mushrooms in the surrounding forest were edible and which were not, a process that involved a bad afternoon in her second October that she did not like to think about but filed carefully away in the part of her mind reserved for lessons that cost something. The third year she put in a proper root cellar. The fourth year she extended the cottage's east wing and added a covered porch with a view down the valley. On clear evenings she would sit on that porch and watch the sky go from yellow to orange to the particular blue that comes just before actual dark, and she would listen to the hum. She had begun to suspect by the fourth year that the hum was not natural. Not in the sense that she thought it was supernatural. Mara Voss was not a woman given to mystical interpretation. She had grown up in a community defined by transformation, by the biological fact of shifting, by the reality of a body that could be two things, and that experience had made her unusually practical about the nature of reality. The remarkable in her experience was usually just the not yet understood. What she suspected about the hum was more disturbing than anything supernatural. She suspected it was a signal. She could not have explained the exact moment the suspicion became certainty. It happened gradually, the way the understanding of a foreign language happens. First you catch a word, then a pattern, then one morning you realize you have been dreaming in it without noticing. The hum had a rhythm that was too deliberate to be wind. It had variations that did not correspond to weather. And on certain nights, when the sky was very clear and the stars sat hard and bright and close, The hum changed in a way that she could only describe as attentive, as though something was adjusting the frequency to better receive her. She did not tell anyone. There was no one to tell. She started keeping notes instead. The notebook was a thing she had brought from the pack, a lined field journal, the kind used for survey work, with a water-resistant cover. She had filled 3/4 of it during her first year with practical observations, soil composition, wood grain, load-bearing calculations for roof beams. In the 5th year she started a new section at the back, working backwards from the final page, and in this section she wrote about the hum. She wrote down the times it intensified. She wrote down the emotional states that seemed to coincide with those intensifications, not because she thought her emotions were causing the signal, but because she had noticed a correlation, and correlation was always worth noting. She wrote down the nights she dreamed in patterns she didn't understand, the nights she woke at 3 in the morning with the absolute conviction that she was being observed, and the mornings after those nights when she found herself knowing things she had not previously known. Small things at first. The name of a bird she had never seen before, surfacing complete in her mind, genus, habitat, mating call, with a certainty that felt remembered rather than guessed. A solution to the drainage problem along the east garden bed appearing to her fully formed between sleeping and waking. The sense, persistent and strange and not entirely unwelcome, of a presence at the edge of her perception, the way you can sometimes feel the shape of a room before you open your eyes. She wrote all of it down. She named it nothing. She simply recorded. On the last night of her 5th year on the ridge, the hum became a voice. It wasn't a voice the way a person's voice is a voice, carried in air, shaped by a throat and teeth and the soft architecture of the human mouth. It was more fundamental than that. It arrived in the same register as understanding arrives, below language, below thought, in the place where the organism simply knows. And what it communicated, arriving in that place, was this: "We have been watching the dreaming ones. You are the clearest signal we have found." Mara set down her tea. She sat with this for a long moment. The fire in the stove was low and red. Outside, the wind moved through the conifers in its usual way, and underneath the wind the hum sat steady and deliberate. Her notebook was open on the table in front of her, and she turned to a clean page, uncapped her pen, and wrote, "5th year, final night. Contact established. Query, who is watching?" The answer came in the same register as the question had been received. Not instantly. There was a pause that felt like transmission lag, like the time it takes for a radio signal to travel a very great distance. Then, "We are the Veth. You have been living at our listening post for 5 years. We did not expect the structure you built. We did not expect the garden. We did not expect you to stay." She wrote that down too. Then she wrote, "Why were you watching?" And the hum shifted and the answer arrived. We study the dreaming ones to understand the weakness at the center. Dreams are the frequency on which minds can be restructured. We have done this to other packs. We have done this to your kind before. You are resistant. We wish to understand the mechanism. Mara capped her pen. She sat very still in the way she had learned to sit still during the years on the ridge, which was a quality of stillness different from the stillness of fear or the stillness of waiting. It was the stillness of someone taking accurate inventory. The Veth had been broadcasting at the pack territories for an unknown period. They had restructured minds. She understood this to mean something between manipulation and erasure, the tuning of a person's inner world the way you might tune a radio station until the original signal is replaced entirely. They had done it to other packs. They were studying her because she had resisted, though she had not known she was resisting. She thought about Cassius counting heads in the assembly yard, 31, 32. She thought about the 12 remaining packs and the years of slow, strange decline that everyone attributed to grief and displacement, and the weight of transformation in a world that had been trying to eradicate them for 2 centuries. She thought about what it would mean if the decline was not grief. If the signal had been running underneath the grief the whole time, shaping it, deepening it, turning what might have been survivable sorrow into something structural and permanent. Then she opened her notebook to a new page and she wrote, "I need to understand your transmission mechanism. Tell me how you broadcast." The pause before the answer was longer this time. "Then, why do you want to know this?" She wrote, "Because I'm going to reverse it." The Veth were very old. This was the first thing she understood about them. In the weeks that followed, as the nightly contact sessions extended and she filled pages with observations, and the back section of her journal became the front section, and she began a second journal and then a third. They were old in the way that geological formations are old. Not in a manner that implies wisdom, exactly, but in a manner that implies the kind of slow patience that comes from existing for so long that the concept of urgency has simply never had cause to develop. They had found the dreaming ones, which was their name for humanity's shifter communities. Specifically, though their interest in ordinary humans was of a different, dimmer, more ambient quality, approximately 300 years ago, by their reckoning, though Mara had reason to believe their sense of time was as compressed and elastic as their sense of space. They had been broadcasting what they called the deep frequency since then, not as an act of malice, but as a form of study. They wanted to understand how consciousness worked in a form that was doubled, that occupied two biological states simultaneously. The mechanism of the shift fascinated them in the same way that a very complex lock might fascinate a creature that had never needed a door. The effect on the packs, the slow dulling, the accumulated grief that calcified into incapacity, this was, in their estimation, a side effect. They did not express guilt about it. They did not express the absence of guilt about it. They registered it the way you might register the disturbance your shadow makes on the ground, a secondary phenomenon, real but not central. This made Mara angry. She was careful about her anger. She had learned, in 5 years of solitude, that anger was a fuel that could be wasted or directed, and waste was the thing she could least afford. She directed it into study. The transmission mechanism, as she came to understand it, was elegant and deeply uninvited. The Veth broadcast on a frequency that resonated with the particular neural architecture of the shift, the doubled consciousness layer, the place in the mind where the two selves negotiated. On that frequency, they ran a signal that the receiving mind could not distinguish from its own internal voice. It did not override or replace existing thought. It simply added to it, the way a second musical instrument added to an existing melody, until gradually the added voice was the one setting the pace, and the original voice had forgotten it had ever led. It was the subtlety of it that was the real horror, not control but contamination, not invasion but residue. Strange residues, she thought one night, almost with amusement, the things left behind by something that passed through. The reason she had been resistant was, as far as she could determine, the hum. Not resistant in the sense of immune, the signal had been reaching her. But the hum, the natural frequency of the ridge, the thing she had been living beside for 5 years, the thing that had drawn her here before she understood what she was being drawn toward, the hum had given her a countersignal. Not a designed countersignal, something more accidental and more human, simply noise. Simply the constant presence of another frequency in the same register, the way you can't hear one conversation clearly if another is being conducted in the same tone at the same volume. The ridge, entirely by accident, had been jamming the Veth's signal for 5 years, and living inside the jam, she had remained her own. She turned this over in her mind for several days. Then she began to take the hum apart. She didn't have instruments, not the kind you'd need for this in any formal sense. What she had was her notebooks, her 5 years of observational data, her particular habit of mind that had always found the pattern faster than the explanation. She began mapping the hum, the times of day when it intensified, the weather conditions that seemed to affect its clarity, the relationship between its pitch and the specific stands of timber that occupied the ridge. She walked the perimeter of the ridge in systematic grids, noting where the hum was strongest and where it faded, flagging positions with split sticks pushed into the ground. She built a map. The map revealed a shape, a rough ellipse, oriented northeast by southwest, corresponding approximately to the ridge's highest geological features. The strongest signal points were at the tips of the ellipse. She had built her cottage, she realized, almost exactly at the center. By accident, by the instinct of something that was listening before it knew it was listening. She built a resonance amplifier from salvaged materials, and the principles of acoustics she had taught herself from a textbook she'd carried up from the valley in year 2. The device was not elegant. It was essentially a parabolic dish made from salvaged satellite dish components she'd hiked down and carried back up over 3 days, paired with a microphone element she'd extracted from a dead handheld radio and a series of tuned chambers built from sections of different diameter pipe. She mounted it on the porch railing and aimed it at the strongest point on her map. The hum, amplified and directed, became audible. Not comfortable, it had a quality that made her back teeth ache, but real, a thing she could work with. She sent it back. The Veth noticed. The contact session that night was different in texture from all the ones before it. The communication came faster with less lag, and the register had changed. The ambient quality was gone, and what replaced it was something sharper, more specific. More, she searched for the word, alarmed. "What have you done?" She wrote, "I've been listening to you for 5 years. Now I'm returning the signal. You cannot do this. The frequency will interfere with our mapping arrays." She wrote, "Good." There was a long pause. "Then you do not understand what you risk. We are not the only ones listening. There are others of our kind who have less interest in study. If you disrupt our broadcast, they will respond differently." She wrote, "Is that a threat?" The response was neither confirmation nor denial, which she took as confirmation. She wrote, "Then I need to work faster." She had not spoken to another person in 11 months when she first attempted to describe the Veth to herself in writing. The challenge was not the alienness of them. She had expected alien to be alien, had braced herself for the cognitive discomfort of encountering a form of consciousness organized along completely different principles than her own. The challenge was the familiarity. The Veth, in their way, were recognizable in the manner that the bones of a very different animal are recognizable, the same underlying logic, articulated differently. They wanted to understand. They observed and cataloged and developed hypotheses and revised them when the data didn't fit. They were patient with the things they didn't know. They were impatient with things they had already decided. She recognized this because she was also this. What she was not, had never been, was what they had assumed she was. The Veth's model of the dreaming ones of the shifter communities was built on a century of observation through the deep frequency. Through that observation they had mapped what happened in the brain during the shift, had cataloged the doubled consciousness, had monitored thousands of individual minds over decades, and charted the patterns of thought and feeling that recurred across them. They believed, on the basis of this data, that they understood humanity's shifter kind reasonably well. They did not understand that all of their data had been collected through a medium that was changing what it observed. This was the thing she kept returning to in the early months, turning it over the way you turn a stone over to see what's living underneath. The deep frequency, broadcast at the manipulation register, had not simply dampened the packs. It had also altered what the Veth received. They had been studying minds that were being reshaped by their study. Every data point they collected was downstream of a signal they themselves were sending. Their entire model of the dreaming ones was a model of the dreaming ones under sedation. She tried to explain this to Kale in the 6th month of their contact. She used the image of a naturalist who studies birds by playing recordings of distress calls near their nests, and then writes papers about how bird behavior is characterized by heightened alarm. The pause that followed this was one of the longest silences of their exchange. "Then, you are saying our data is corrupted." She wrote, "I'm saying your methodology produced your conclusions." Another long pause. "Then, we have been observing for a century. We have thousands of subjects across 12 communities. The consistency of the data." She wrote, "The consistency of the data tells you that the signal is consistent. It doesn't tell you what the subjects would be without it." She waited. Then he communicated something she had not expected from him. The quality of someone who has looked at a thing from one direction for a very long time and is now being required to walk around it. Not resistance. More like the particular vertigo of a perspective shift, the feeling of the ground rearranging under a long-held assumption. After a time he communicated, what would they be without it? She set her pen down and looked at the fire for a while before she answered. Then she wrote, "I don't know yet. That's what I'm trying to find out. That's what you've been preventing me from finding out. That's what you've been preventing them from finding out about themselves for 100 years." She underlined the last sentence, which she did not normally do. Then she looked at it and decided to leave the underline in. The Alpha King of the Veth was not a king in any human sense. He held no territory, performed no ceremonial functions, wore nothing that could be called a crown. He was the oldest of them, and in a species where age was the sole measure of precedence, this made him the center around which all decisions eventually orbited. His name translated, approximately, as the one who remembers the first frequency, the original signal from which all subsequent Veth communication had derived. They called him Veth Kale. He had been the one to find her. This was the piece of information she extracted slowly, over weeks of careful questioning, working it out the way you work out the shape of something you can't see directly by its effects, by what it displaced. Kale had been monitoring the deep frequency arrays for the past century and had been the first to notice the anomaly at the ridge, the human settlement, the counter-resonance, the mind that was present in the data but was not being shaped by it. He had directed the study toward her. He had been the voice, or the equivalent of a voice, in her fifth-year contact. He had expected, she understood gradually, a different response. Study subjects did not typically request the transmission mechanism. They certainly did not attempt to build counter-broadcast arrays from salvaged satellite dishes on remote ridges. In the 6th week of their sessions, he asked her a direct question. The directness of it surprised her, accustomed as she had become to the oblique, layered quality of Veth communication. He asked, "Why did you leave your pack?" She held her pen above the notebook for a long moment. She wrote, "Because staying was making me nothing." And then, because she believed in precision, she added, "Something was smoothing me out. Flattening the frequency, you'd call it. I didn't know what. I just knew I had to go somewhere the flattening couldn't reach." The pause was the longest she had experienced. "Then you felt the deep frequency." She wrote, "I felt something. I didn't know what it was. I just knew it was wrong." Kale communicated, "Most do not feel it. Most receive it as their own thought." She wrote, "Most didn't grow up with a mother who taught them to listen to what the wind is actually doing, instead of what it sounds like it's doing." Another pause, then something she had not encountered before in their exchanges, a quality she could only describe as rueful, not apology. Something more complex than apology, the way an ancient stone formation is more complex than a wall. "You have built a very interesting thing on our listening post," he communicated. "We did not intend for anyone to live here." She wrote, "I know. I didn't intend to save my people when I moved here, but here we are." The work took the rest of that year and most of the next. She understood, midway through, that she was not going to be able to do this alone, not the final stage of it. The amplified resonance she could broadcast from the ridge would reach the nearest packed territory, possibly two. The deep frequency had been running for 3 centuries across a much wider range. To interrupt it at scale, she needed something the Veth had and she did not. Reach. She needed Kale. This was the calculation she turned over in her mind on the long evenings of year 6, sitting on the porch in the dark, with the amplifier running at low power and the valley below her invisible, except for the occasional light of a distant settlement blinking on and off like a slow heartbeat. She needed the entity that had been directing the contamination of her people to help her end it. She needed to persuade the alpha king of a species that viewed humanity's shifter communities as study subjects to redirect his entire observation apparatus. She thought about how you persuaded something ancient. You didn't appeal to guilt. You didn't threaten, or you didn't only threaten. You appealed to the thing that actually moved it. And the thing that moved Kale, as far as she could determine, was the same thing that had moved him toward her in the first place. Genuine curiosity about something he didn't understand. She was the most interesting data point he had encountered in a century of study. She intended to keep being interesting. She began to teach him things. Not things he wanted to know. She was past that phase of their relationship, if relationship was even the word. She taught him things he had not known to want. She described the sensation of the shift, not the mechanics. She was certain he had mapped those, cataloged them, reduced them to frequency signatures and neural patterns in ways that had nothing to do with the actual lived experience. She described what it felt like from the inside. The moment of becoming, the way 2 forms of perception occupied the same instant of awareness, the specific kind of ache that accompanied the return to a single shape, the nostalgia for the expanded self, the way you walked through the rest of your day feeling slightly narrowed, slightly too contained, the way a musician who has been playing an enormous instrument feels the smallness of their own hands afterward. She described grief. She described what it had felt like to watch the pack, her pack, people she had grown up beside, people whose voices she could recognize at 50 meters by the particular way they called each other's names, become less. Not less in the dramatic sense, in the quiet sense. The way a photograph left in sunlight becomes less, incrementally, over years, until one day you realize it has faded past the point of recognition. She described what the deep frequency was doing, from the inside of a mind that had escaped it. Kale listened. She knew he was listening because the contact sessions extended, because his questions became more specific, because the quality of his attention shifted, became less the attention of a scientist cataloging data, and more the attention of someone who has encountered a piece of information that requires them to revise an assumption they did not know they had made. She wrote one evening, "Do you know what music is?" He did not in the experiential sense. He knew the mechanical principles. She had expected this. She described it. Not technically. She described the first time she had heard a human voice singing something beautiful in the cold. She had been 11, standing outside the Pax Gathering Hall on a winter night, and through the wall she had heard an old woman singing something slow and low, and the sound of it had reached into her chest and rearranged something, and she had stood in the dark and the cold and not gone in, not wanting to interrupt whatever was happening between herself and that sound. She wrote, "That's what you've been interfering with. Not just the shift, not just the community structure, the internal music, the thing each of us carries that is specifically, irreducibly ourselves." A long pause. She wrote, "And I need you to help me give it back." The negotiation, such as it was, took place over 4 nights. She was not naive about what she was asking. She was asking an ancient, patient, powerful entity to disrupt a 3-century research program for the benefit of a set of beings it had been studying as objects rather than recognizing as subjects. She was asking it on the basis of a quality of attention she had cultivated over months of careful conversation. She was asking it in the absence of any leverage except the one she had, that she was the most interesting anomaly he had ever studied, and she was the only one telling him the truth about what his study cost. She made no dramatic speech. She did not talk about the destiny of humanity or the natural rights of sentient beings or any of the other large abstractions that she suspected would have the same effect on Kale that they had on her, which was a mild impatience and the sense that the speaker was substituting the general for the specific because the specific was too difficult. She stayed specific. She stayed precise. She told him exactly what the deep frequency had done to exactly the people she had grown up among, and she told him exactly what she needed from him, and she told him what she would give in return. What she offered was this: she would remain at the ridge, she would continue the contact. She would document for him the recovery, if recovery happened, which she was not going to promise, because she didn't make promises she couldn't keep. She would be, in a sense, what she had already been for 5 years without knowing it, a human instrument placed at the intersection of two frequencies, recording what happened in the space between. But she would do it voluntarily, as a subject who had chosen to be here rather than an object who had been tuned without consent. And that distinction, she told him, was the only thing that made any data he collected worth anything. It was the last sentence that got him. She knew it when the pause that followed it was not the pause of processing, but the pause of recognition. He said, communicated, something she had not expected. He said, "We did not think you could choose. We thought the dreaming ones chose only between instincts." She wrote, "That is the core of your error." And then, because she was exhausted, and it was very late and the fire had burned down to coals, "That's what I've been trying to tell you." She sometimes thought about what it would take to explain this to people who had not been here. Not to Cassius. Cassius she understood well enough to know what he would need, which was not persuasion but demonstration, not theory but evidence. Cassius had always been a man who trusted what he could put his hands on. She had 7 journals of meticulous data. She had the amplifier. She had the map of the ridge's ellipse and the signal strength notations, and the log of every contact session with timestamps, and her own observations about the quality of Kale's communication in each one. She could demonstrate. But beyond Cassius, beyond the pack that had once been hers, the other 11 packs and whatever remained of the council structure that had governed them in her childhood, before the decline had eaten away at even that, she thought about those people and what they would need, and the answer was harder. People who had been living under a signal for 100 years and had thought it was their own grief. How do you tell them that some of the grief was real and some of it was manufactured, that they are entitled to be angry about the manufactured grief, but also entitled to grieve the real parts, that both things are true simultaneously? How do you tell a community that its decline was not its fault, and also that the work of rebuilding belongs entirely to it? That one truth does not negate the other. She didn't know yet. That was honest. She wrote it in the notebooks. Don't know how to communicate this to a large group without either minimizing the real loss or maximizing the alien causation in a way that becomes a new excuse for not building. Find the language. The language exists. Find it. She had always believed that. The language for hard things exists. You just have to do the work of finding it, which is different from making it up. You can't make it up. Made-up language for hard things is what the deep frequency had been, a false voice in the register of a true one, designed to sound like the original, and failing, ultimately, to do so, because false signals have a texture that the human mind can feel if it is not too far gone to feel anything. She had felt it, at 26, without knowing what it was. She had felt the wrongness of the flatness, the wrongness of the smoothing, and she had done the only thing she knew how to do, which was to remove herself from it and go somewhere she could listen to herself in peace. She did not think of this as courage. It had not felt like courage at the time. It had felt like necessity, but she was beginning to understand that this was what courage usually was, not the dramatic gesture, not the declaration, not the moment of bright decision, but the small, unglamorous act of removing yourself from the thing that was flattening you and going to a cold ridge and building a crooked wall and starting again. The hum on those early evenings of year one had felt like company. She had not known why. She had simply been glad of it. In the weeks before Cassius came up the trail, the packs were dreaming differently. She did not know this directly. There was no mechanism by which she could observe what was happening in the valley communities from her ridge. But she inferred it from what she knew about the signal's withdrawal and from the nature of what had been suppressed. When a long-applied pressure lifts, the things it held down do not rise slowly. They rush. They come up fast and urgent and somewhat overwhelming, the way underground water comes up when you remove a weight, not a trickle but a surge, carrying with it the sediment of however long it has been held below. She inferred that the dreams had returned first. Dreams were the register in which the deep frequency operated. The Veth had told her this, had explained that the doubled consciousness of the shifter mind was most accessible in the dreaming state, when the negotiation between the two selves was most active and most visible. The signal had been quieting the dreams, making them thin and gray and forgettable. The quality of a pack's dreaming had been one of the early indicators Kale had shown her. Data from communities where the frequency was running strongest showed a near-total suppression of what he called the complex resonance pattern, which she had translated to herself as, the dreams stopped being interesting. When the frequency withdrew, she expected the dreams to come back loud, vivid, disorienting, saturated with things that had been suppressed, faces and landscapes and old conversations, and the particular kind of dream sensation that is not quite memory and not quite invention, that strange residue of the self that accumulates during sleep and is normally processed and discharged into daily consciousness, but had instead been dammed up by a signal the dreamers didn't know was there. She expected the packs to wake from their dreams in the first weeks after the withdrawal and feel as though something enormous was trying to climb back into them. She expected some of them would be frightened. She expected some of them would go to their pack leaders and describe the dreams and be told, gently, that times of stress could produce vivid dreaming, and this was normal and would pass. She expected Cassius to have 3 or 4 nights of this before he understood that something had changed that was not stress-related and not normal in the sense of ordinary human variation, but was instead the lifting of something that had been there so long it had been mistaken for the floor. She expected him to be very still when he understood this. Cassius was a man who, when genuinely shaken, became very still. She had seen it twice in her life. Once when his father died, which she had witnessed from across the assembly yard, the messenger, Cassius standing with his arms at his sides, the quality of absolute stillness that came over him like a physical change, the world rearranging itself around the fact of it. And once when she had told him at 25, 1 year before she left, that she thought something was wrong with the pack and she didn't know what it was, but it had a quality she could only describe as structural. He had gone still then too. He had told her quietly that grief was structural by nature, that 3 generations of displacement and loss had built a particular architecture of sorrow in the packs, and that this was real and it was theirs, and the work was to live inside it rather than looking for something external to blame. She had sat with this for a year. She had tried to believe it. She had wanted to believe it, because Cassius was not a stupid man, and he was not an unfeeling man, and he had stood inside the same grief she was describing, and had concluded something reasonable from it. She had not been able to make herself believe it. Not because she was certain he was wrong, but because the wrongness she felt had a specific texture that did not match the texture of grief, even deep and structural grief. Grief had a quality of depth to it. It went down, it had bottom notes, it resonated in the low registers of the self. What she was describing was something that sat on top of the self, not below, on the surface, a flatness, a smoothing, like something sitting on a signal. She had not had that image at the time. She found it later in year 3, making notes about the hum, and she recognized it with the peculiar feeling of belated accuracy. The image that fits a thing perfectly and arrives just late enough that you have had to work without it. The deep frequency changed in late autumn of her 7th year on the ridge. She felt it before she recorded it, a shift in the ambient texture of the hum, the way you feel a change in pressure before the weather actually turns. She went out onto the porch in the cold and stood with her face toward the northeast and listened, and what she heard was the signal pulling back from the close, insistent intimacy it had maintained for 3 centuries and settling into something more distant, more disengaged, something that was still present but was no longer shaping. She stood there for a long time. Then she went inside and built up the fire and sat at her table with a clean page and wrote, very carefully, the date and the time and the following. Signal withdrawal confirmed. Frequency still detectable at ambient level, no longer broadcasting at the manipulation register. She paused. She added it worked. Then she sat with that for a while. The pack would not know what had happened. They would feel it, she was certain of that, the way she was certain of all the things she had learned in 7 years of paying very close attention to things most people walked past without looking. They would feel the deep frequency withdraw the way you feel the lifting of a pressure you have lived under for so long you had stopped registering it as pressure. It would feel like grief lifting. It would feel like remembering something important. It would feel like hearing music after a long silence, which is a sensation that is very close to pain before it becomes joy. She thought about Cassius, 31, 32, the fold where her name had gone. She thought about the 12 packs and the years of slow decline, and the old woman singing through a winter wall. She did not cry. She had learned, a long time ago, that some things were too large to fit inside an emotional response, and the correct way to honor them was to note them accurately and let them be what they were. She went to bed. In the morning, very early, before the light was fully established, she put on her boots and her coat and she walked the perimeter of the ridge in the cold, the way she did at the start of every serious day, checking the tree line, checking the garden beds under their winter mulch, checking the amplifier on the porch railing. The hum was still there, changed but there. The ridge had been a listening post long before the Veth had used it. It would go on being a listening post after them. She was halfway around the perimeter when she saw the figure at the bottom of the ridge trail. She stopped. The figure was standing at the tree line below the cottage, at the base of the access trail that switchbacked up from the valley. It was a long way down and the light was early and gray, but she had spent 7 years learning to read distance, and she knew the figure. Not by any single feature, but by the sum of them. The particular way this person stood, the angle of weight distribution, the almost imperceptible forward lean that meant they were working up to something. She had known him her whole life. Cassius stood at the bottom of the trail and looked up. She stood at the top of the ridge and looked down. The distance between them was real and large and cold. He had not started climbing. She had not started descending. They were simply 2 people looking at each other across something enormous, which might have been distance or might have been time or might have been 7 years of silence so dense it had become a kind of terrain in itself. She watched him look up. He had aged. She could see that from here, which meant the aging was significant. His hair had gone to gray at the temples, and he held himself differently. Not smaller, exactly, but with a weight distributed differently than she remembered, the weight of something that had been put down being carried differently than the weight of something still held. She wondered what the end of the signal felt like from inside a mind that had been receiving it. She wondered how much of what the packs had become was the signal and how much was simply time, and whether that question was even answerable, and decided it probably wasn't, and that was all right. He had come, that was the thing. She didn't know how he'd found the ridge. Someone in the valley who'd seen her over the years, probably. Or his own instinct, if the instinct was coming back now that what had been sitting on it was gone. Or both. She thought about the dreams she'd described to Kale, The way a frequency cleared from a signal left a space that the original voice rushed back to fill, urgent and vivid. The way a river reroutes itself after a blockage is removed, following the channels memory has made. Maybe he had dreamed of her. She thought about going down. She thought about waiting for him to come up. She thought about the 7 years of notebook pages and the crooked first wall and the root cellar and the porch and the amplifier and the quiet, specific, stubbornly accumulated life she had built at the center of a listening post by accident and then on purpose. She thought about the fact that she had not left because she was done with them. She had left because she needed to be somewhere the signal couldn't follow, somewhere she could remain herself long enough to find out what that meant, and then do something useful with it. And she had. And now it was done, or the first hard part of it was done, and whatever came next would require a different kind of work. She raised her hand. Just that. The way you'd raise a hand across a room when you've spotted someone you know, no particular gesture, no wave, just the fact of the arm lifted. The simple signal that says, I see you. I'm here. I haven't gone anywhere that matters. He stood very still for a moment. Then he started up the trail. She watched him climb for a while. The trail was steep and the morning was cold and it would take him time. And then she turned back toward the cottage. She needed to start the stove. She needed to put water on. She needed to find the second cup, the one she'd stopped using when she'd stopped having any reason to use it, and wash it and set it on the table in the place where a second cup goes. She had bread from yesterday, and a jar of the wild berry preserves she'd put up in September. She had dried mushrooms and root vegetables in the cellar. She had notes, thousands of pages of notes, about frequencies and signal mechanics, and the ways a mind keeps its own shape under pressure. Notes that were going to need to be organized and understood and eventually communicated in a language that the 12 packs and whatever councils still convened among the scattered communities could actually use. She had a great deal of work still ahead. She thought about this as she filled the kettle and set it on the stove, and felt the particular satisfaction of a person who has always known that work was the answer to most things, and has simply been accumulating the specific work that needed doing. The fire caught. The stove ticked as it heated. Outside on the ridge, the hum continued, ambient now, changed in character, the listening post doing what listening posts do in the absence of something worth transmitting, holding the frequency open, waiting. She set the second cup on the table. The footsteps on the porch steps were heavier than she remembered. He had always been heavy on his feet, not clumsy, but solid, with the particular ground press of someone who has spent their life being the thing others leaned against. The sound of it reached her through the walls of the cottage she had built with her own crooked at first hands, through the walls that had held against every winter the ridge had delivered, and she recognized it the way you recognize something you had not realized you were still carrying. She did not go to the door. She poured the water when it boiled. The knock came and she said in her normal voice without ceremony, "It's open." The door swung in. Cold came with him, and the smell of the trail, pine and soil, and the particular clean, sharp cold of high elevation in the early part of winter, the smell she had been breathing for 7 years and was accustomed to, but which arrived differently now because it was arriving with a person in it. He stood in her doorway and looked at the cottage, the notebook stacks, the amplifier parts on the work table, the maps pinned to the far wall with their ellipses and their signal strength notations, the cups on the table, the stove, and he took a long moment with it, turning it over in a way she recognized as the way people turn over things they had not imagined and are now being required to integrate. She was watching him the way she watched everything, precisely, without performing the watching. He looked at her. She had changed too. 7 years will do that regardless of everything else. She was 33 years old and she had the particular leanness of someone who has been feeding themselves by hand, and she had the particular directness of someone who has been their only company for most of a decade, and she had in her eyes, she knew, the quality that the 7 years had put there, the thing that could not be faked or performed, which was simply the look of someone who had understood something difficult and continued anyway. He said finally, "You built this." "Yes," she said. He looked around once more and then back at her. His voice, when it came, was quiet, not small, but careful. The voice of someone who has spent the recent weeks rediscovering the range and capability of their own internal experience and is still finding the edges of it. "I forgot what things tasted like," he said. "The past few weeks, it's been like something lifting, something I didn't know was there." "I know," she said. "You know what it was?" "Yes." He absorbed this. He had come up the trail alone, she noted. He had not brought an escort, had not announced himself, had not arrived in any of the formal postures of a pack leader approaching another pack member who had gone outside the line. He had climbed up a mountain in the early morning and knocked on a door. She thought this was the most honest thing she had ever seen him do. She said, "Sit down. I'll tell you what I know. There's a great deal of it, and I need someone to help me figure out how to explain it to people who weren't here." He sat down. She sat across from him. Between them, the 2 cups steamed in the cold air of the cottage she had built on a ridge that had been a listening post for 300 years without knowing it, in the 7th year of a choice that had looked, from the outside, like departure, and had been, from the inside, the longest and most specific approach. She opened her notebook. He looked at it, the worn cover, the ink-stained edges, the thickness of the pages, and she watched him put together the scale of it. Not just this journal, the stack on the work table, the 3 shelf lengths of field journals on the wall beside the maps. "How long have you been writing?" he said. "Since year 1, she said. "The first 3/4 of that journal is building calculations and soil notes. The back section is where it starts." He was quiet for a moment. "You knew," he said. "When you came here, you knew something was." "I didn't know anything. I felt something. It's different." She turned to the first pages of the back section, where the early contact notes were, the handwriting slightly less steady than her current hand, the phrasing more cautious. "I didn't have a name for it. I had an intuition and the habit of writing things down and 7 years to work it out." He looked at the page. She watched him reading, not fast, the way people read when they are trying to get through a thing, but slowly, with the quality of attention he brought to things that had cost him something to encounter. His hands were on the table in front of him. She noticed that they were shaking slightly, which she thought was probably the cold, and thought was probably also not only the cold. "The deep frequency," he said quietly, not a question, tasting the term. "That's what they call it, the Veth." She turned a few pages forward to the first diagram she had made of the transmission mechanism. "I'll start from the beginning. It'll take a while." "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She looked at him. He held her gaze. Not the way he'd once held her gaze, not with the authority of the pack leader, the habitual dominance that had been so long a part of how he occupied space that she didn't think he noticed it most of the time. He held it differently now. The authority was still there. It was bone deep in him. It didn't leave. But there was something else underneath it now, or maybe something beside it, the way you can find a new room in a house you've lived in for years when you move a piece of furniture you've always left in place. It was the quality of someone who had thought they knew the shape of something and had very recently discovered the shape was larger. That quality made him look, just for a moment, like the younger version of him she remembered from before the decline had set its weight on him, not young exactly, but clear, unclouded. She thought, yes, that's what it was supposed to look like. She thought, this is what the signal was costing them. Not just productivity or cohesion or structural pack function. The clearness, the quality of attention a mind brings to itself and to the people in front of it when it is not being continuously, silently, invisibly managed. She thought, we have so much work to do. She said, the Veth broadcast on a frequency that resonates with the neural architecture of the shift, the doubled consciousness, the dreaming layer. They've been running this signal for approximately 300 years across the Northern Territories, though my evidence on the pre-100-year period is inferential. Their stated intent was research. Their actual effect was, she paused, choosing the word carefully, contamination. The signal doesn't override existing thought. It adds to it in the same register until the addition becomes the dominant voice. She turned the diagram to face him. And the reason it didn't work on me, she continued, is that I was living accidentally inside a countersignal. The ridge hums. It's been humming since before the Veth arrived. It's a geological phenomenon, possibly tidal resonance, possibly something structural in the rock formation. The Veth recognized it as a useful property and put their listening post here. What they didn't anticipate was a person moving in and living inside the interference pattern for 5 years. Cassius looked at the diagram for a long time. Then he said, "You came here because of the hum." "I came here because I needed to go somewhere," she said. "The hum is why I stayed." He was quiet again. In that way he had. "The dreams," he said finally. "The past few weeks, I thought it was grief, coming back, some final accounting of it." He looked at her. "It's not grief." "It's not only grief," she said. "Some of what you feel is grief. You're entitled to it, but some of what's coming back is just you, the parts of you that were being managed. The signal is gone now. What you're experiencing is the restoration of what was suppressed." He absorbed this. "Can it be put back," he said quietly, "by them?" "No." She said it without hesitation, because she had spent 6 months extracting this guarantee in 17 different formulations from every angle she could think of, and she was certain of it. The agreement with Kale is binding in a way that matters to the Veth. They don't have the concept of law, but they have something older, which is the concept of data contamination. He has accepted that his study has been producing contaminated data for a century. He needs clean data to correct his model. Clean data requires unmanipulated subjects. He won't put the signal back because putting it back destroys the validity of everything he's trying to understand. She paused. "Also," she said, "I told him that if the signal came back, I would stop cooperating and he would lose his best data point." Cassius looked at her. Something moved across his face that she recognized only slowly, because she had not seen it in a long time on his face or anywhere, and it took her a moment to identify it. He was trying not to smile. "You negotiated with an alien," he said, "on behalf of the 12 packs." "I negotiated with an alien on behalf of the 12 packs, yes," she said, "while building a garden, while figuring out the drainage issue on the east bed, while eating a lot of mushrooms." She paused. "I had a very bad October in year 2 involving mushrooms. Don't ask." He did smile then. She had forgotten what that looked like too. He said, "What do we do now?" She had been waiting for this question. She turned to a clean page. A page she had, in fact, prepared for this conversation, because she believed in preparation, and uncapped her pen. "Now," she said, "we figure out how to tell this to 11 other pack leaders without making any of them feel like victims, without allowing any of them to use it as an excuse to stop building, and without starting a 300-year war with a species that, whatever else they've done, has agreed to stop doing it." She looked at him across the notebooks and the maps and the 2 cups of tea. In the cottage she had built on the ridge that hummed at the center of an ancient listening post, in the 7th year of the choice that had looked like leaving but had been, the whole time, the longest and most particular kind of return. "It's going to be a lot of work," she said. He reached for his cup. "I know," he said. "Tell me where to start." She began,